Hi, today I want to show you how I have been working on a cast-off mannequin from a clothing store and repositioning the limbs so that it's in an active pose. So this is the hip joint that you can see. It does screw in here, but there is a large part that's the structure that I want to stay away from cutting into. That stabilizes the structure. What I used to cut was a very simple tool, hacksaw, nothing special at all, and use that. I propped the leg in that and was able to cut right through it. Then I sanded the edges. I took a rough sandpaper, really simple rough sandpaper. This is a doesn't really matter what size it is, but I roughed up the edge. It's in Japanese, so I couldn't tell you anyway. So I roughed up the surface edge, and this edge is already roughed up from sawing. The same is true on the base of the leg. This edge is roughed up from sawing. Now the leg had been like that, so it had been a perfectly straight leg. And what I did when I cut the pieces out, I cut wedges out because I wanted it to bend backwards, as if the mannequin was kicking off on something. And so I cut wedges out of the back so that this leg will come back here. And what I did was take those wedges and reuse them and put them into the front of the leg, because when you bend your leg back, you're stretching the skin at the hip bone in the front, and it's compressed in the back, if you think about it. So that's where I started cutting. And what I'd like to show you is something that I did earlier. So this is the same mannequin. This is the arm. I wanted the arm to be bent at the shoulder. She's actually going to be reaching upward towards something and grasping something. So again, I stay away from the structure. Don't cut into the structure, and use the wedges from the front into the back. And then the adhesive that I used is epoxy grout. You can see I did the same thing on the elbow and then on each of the fingers that I wanted to modify, because mannequins typically have very straight hands, very nice looking hands, and these will all be covered with tesserae at the end. And I try to eliminate as much of the sanding that I'm going to have to do in the long run by smoothing this out pretty well before it dries. So let's get started. So obviously the leg is going to take a little bit more effort, and what happens with that is that I end up with some gaps. One of the things I do is mark locations with pencil. So if you look at my leg here, I have put in just a piece of mesh and marked the locations where I want that, and I've done that ahead of time because I know this is where I want the leg to be bent. And then I use bags of whatever I have. So I suppose sand or rice would work, but so does Smalties. So I use those to prop up the leg in the place that I want it to be. I take the mesh tape, and in this case I'm going to be using this just preliminary. I can only do one part at a time. You can't do the entire leg all at once. The joint all at once is too large. So I'm going to be taking this and lining it up here. And in order to keep that tape in place, I take the staple gun. The staples will all come out in the long run, but right now the staples are just going to go in there and hold that in place, because the mesh tape is not very sticky, and I want that to stay in place. And the propping it up isn't enough. It just isn't giving it enough substance to hold it in place. So now I generally have this where I want it to stay. If you haven't worked with epoxy sculpt before, epoxy sculpt There's a generic version of this as well, but epoxy sculpt comes in 2 containers, and they have to be mixed in order to harden and create the adhesive quality that I need. So I'm going to take a small amount of each. Just to demonstrate this for you. So I'm going to take a small amount of each out of here so that you know I also have already put on a mask. And before I touch this, I'm going to put on gloves. I do not want to touch it because it just dries my hands out terribly. I forgot to put the gloves on. Now, one of the other things you'll want to know about epoxy sculpt, you'll notice I didn't have the right tool here, so I just used a pair of old scissors that I've been using. I'll clean them off before I do anything, before anything has a chance to harden. But I used this end to take the material out of the white jar, and I am definitely not going to use that end to take the material out of this jar because the entire jar could harden. Like I said, once it's mixed, you don't have a lot of time. You probably have a good half hour to have some flexibility with the material. And I want approximately the same amount of each type. So this is a little bit much. Again, I shouldn't have touched that. I can't put my hand back in there. So I think what I'm going to do is go back and take a little bit more of the light color epoxy sculpt because I do have a plan to use the leftovers. I don't know which end I used, so I'm not going to use that. I'm just using my fingers. So this is about the same amount for each now, just about. And then close the epoxy sculpt up so that it doesn't dry out. Make sure you've closed it and sealed it securely. Put the lid back on, tighten them up. And then I'm going to take the 2 different types of epoxy sculpt and mix them together. And I just keep kneading them together with my fingers until eventually it looks like one solid color. You can see the 2 different versions here, but I'll just keep folding and kneading. And soon I will have one color. And that is the material that once it's mixed thoroughly, then I can use that and fill in the gaps here and use it as an adhesive. I always have some kind of plan for the rest of it, the leftovers. Now on this one I probably won't have any leftovers because I have a large area and I'm only mixing a small amount so that I can work my way around this piece by piece and let it dry thoroughly so that I have it all in the right place. But I'm also working on creating some small mosaics of wildflowers, and so the leftovers I tend to make petals out of, and those I'll use to sculpt and make a 3-dimensional flower. So this looks like it's pretty well mixed. I don't see any variation in color. It looks really good. And then I'm going to take this, and if you remember playing with Play-Doh, I roll it into a snake depending on how thick I need it. Now on the fingers I used a really thin piece because I didn't want to add a lot to the substrate. I just wanted it to adhere. In this case I have gaps in the substrate that I'm going to have to fill. So I'm going to take this and make it a little thicker and make sure these are in place where I wanted them. And like I said, I put some pencil marks on there earlier so I know just where I wanted it to land. And I'm going to press that snake into the opening. Now, if you were to look at the joint at the front of this, it does not look like a human leg because I cut around that structure where I didn't want to disturb the structure. And so it's a little bit odd, but the mannequin that I'm working on is going to have some clothing over it, or an image of some clothing over it. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with that yet, but I'm not concerned about the elbow or the shoulder or the hip being cut in the wrong place, in terms of human structure, at least in terms of what we're accustomed to seeing. But you can see I'm filling that, and you can see it's cracking and moving on me. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to have to get this to stay in place, and it's not going to stay in place just with that mesh. So I have packing tape. I'm still being really careful to not touch the tips of those scissors together because they will be permanently stuck together too. So I'm taking the packing tape, I'm lining it back up to where it should be, and I'll get that in place right there. And that should pretty much hold it until the epoxy sculpt dries. You can see I'm filling the openings and pressing it in as much as I can because I don't want huge lumps left. And one of the things I do when I have credit cards left over is I cut them in strips. I'm a persistent recycler, reuser, and they work really well for smoothing things out. I actually used a credit card recently to clean off some grout from an epoxy grout from the surface of a large piece, and it made it a lot easier to smooth it out and get a lot of it off of there before I started having to wipe it down. Okay, so this is in place. This doesn't look like it's going to stay where I want to put it, so I'm going to put yet another piece of tape on here. If I can find the end. Most likely I need to take my glove off to do this, find the end of this again. Yep. Because I do want this to be very stable as I allow it to dry. This time I'll remember to fold the end of the tape under so that I don't have to search so hard for it. Okay. There, that should hold it in place. I'm going to take the camera and move it after I get this next piece on. I want you to see what it looks like when I stop working and let it dry, because I think that's pretty important to understand that this is definitely not the finished product. Okay, so here are my pieces. I'm going to use those to fill that in because it's going to have to be filled eventually. Now, with a big gap like that, I may very well end up using some mortar to fill it rather than just continuing to use epoxy sculpt. It's not always necessary to use the epoxy sculpt if I can find another way. Epoxy sculpt is not inexpensive, but it works wonderfully for this. So I'll get that smoothed out. I'll get more on this side between the areas that I have open and press it into the opening. you notice I had those wedges already in there, and all I used on those wedges was Gorilla Glue, because they weren't my permanent solution. It was to get the wedge in place. Just tacked it, but there were still gaps that I'm filling now with epoxy sculpt. Okay, so there's still some work to do on here, but I want to take my phone and show you what I have so far. So this is the joint that I've been working on. You can see that there's still a large gap in the back, and like I said, I'll put mesh, and I may even use something just like mortar to fill it. I'm not sure yet. We'll see how much of a gap there is when I get the mesh in. And that's pretty much what I do. The staples, you can see I did not tack the staples in really tightly, because before I finish the mesh, I'll be pulling those out, and I'll cut the extra mesh around the epoxy sculpt and get rid of it. And that's really all there is to it. One of the bigger things is understanding how to get your mannequin to balance. And so as you do this, you can see that I have the leg that attaches to the base. I'm not touching that because there's structure here, there's structure in the hip, and I want that to continue up to the top. And I'm being very careful with that. Every time I make a change, I check and see where the balance point is, and whether or not the mannequin is going to still be able to stand with this base and be stable. Hopefully this helps all of you who are trying to alter your own mannequins.